What I'd like to offer you this afternoon is some kind of sense of what we mean by stages of consciousness. Now, don't let that scare you off. The dangers of it, of course, are that it looks like it's a ranking and an elitism and a saying, and of course the ego naturally wants to say it's at the higher stages. Mistrust any temptation to interpret this that way. In fact, I would say the sign of an enlightened person is that you almost don't care about what I'm just going to teach you. But I'm going to give it to you anyway, because you've got to see where this is all leading and what regressive behavior is. Or you have no criteria for judging. It becomes what Ken Wilber calls flatland. And we've got a lot of flatland where we naively say everything is beautiful. As I mentioned this morning, our understanding of the good, the true, and the beautiful is not the eliminating of the ugly and the terrible and the bad. It's the integrating, not the eliminating. That's very different. So we can't be naive either about the brokenness of all things, the capacity for evil, for regression, for stupidity, for the creation of ugliness, which is what Thomas rightly called this morning sin, to miss the mark. So we got to know there is a mark, or you don't have any directionality to things, any criteria by which to judge things. Now, I'm going to slightly go through this, and toward the end of it, I'm going to ask the folks in the back to give you this as a single-page handout. So do know that you're going to have some of this in hand at the end. But any of you who are teachers, you know that you never give the handout at the beginning. Because you'll just sit there and read the handout, and you'll jump 3 steps ahead of me. And this way you'll have to stick with me, and we can sort of develop it, and then we will give you this at the end. Now, part of what I was saying this morning, especially about the Trinity, just to use a little different language, and there's 1,000 levels of language once the mystery opens up. What we're saying is that God is much more a verb than a noun. And it's a very different way for most theists to think. Because we think of God as static, as a solitary on a throne. That's the pyramidal universe, where all the truth is top down. But once we say that God is a verb, the universe moves much more from a pyramid to a circle. That's why the Trinity was defined as a circle dance, and why the atom and the galaxies are in orbits, in circles of relationship. Now we call it eco-spirituality or ecology. This recognizing that none of us are independent. And I think the illusion of the rich person is precisely that. And why Jesus said the rich person will have such a hard time entering the kingdom of God. Because richness almost implies an illusion of self-sufficiency. An illusion that I did it. Did any of you watch that show, Guns, Germs, and Steel? Where he tries to point out, for example, why is it that this accidental small continent of Europe ended up dominating almost the entire globe, the European nations. And this scholar was committed to finding that out. Well, one of his big reasons, if you watched it, it was quite fascinating. And I would have never thought this way. But he says, all of the domesticatable animals, with the exception of, I think, 2 or 3, were found in what was the Fertile Crescent, the Middle East. They were quickly taken up by Europeans. The Europeans for centuries lived with these domesticated animals like goats and sheep and horses and oxen, which first of all plowed their fields for them and provided food for them and just gave them a huge advance over people who live in New Guinea, for example, who have no domesticatable animals. They got to do all the work themselves. But not only was it that these animals gave the Europeans such a huge head start. But, and I would have never thought of this, because our ancestors, if you're from a European ancestry, they lived with these animals for centuries, we all developed immunities through the animals, right? That most other peoples on the earth never developed. So wherever Europeans moved, we killed everybody else. They all died from smallpox. Whereas centuries of our ancestors living with animals, we all had immunities to smallpox. That I just give you one silly example. Maybe it seems silly to you, but it isn't silly at all. How much we are tied in the great chain of being. And as a good Franciscan, in this case, I have to say, even with the animals. And if we think that we created all this self-sufficiency and superiority, or that Europeans really are smarter than the rest of the world, I mean, present evidence says that isn't true. If anybody is the smartest, it's the Asians. They say the Asians have the best minds. So we can't think we got the best minds. We just had a whole bunch of advantages given to us. And we've all built on them century after century and take it for granted that we have earned this. Again, it's all grace. It's all, as we say at the center, radical grace. But the kind of thinking that I just presented to you is a kind of integrative, synthetic thinking that only comes, I'm not trying to say I'm at a higher level of development, but it does only come at higher stages of consciousness. The lowest stage is very much either-or thinking, black and white thinking. And I'm going to call the first stage, there's going to be 6 of them. The first stage is information. The last stage, which will be to in 40 minutes or so, is transformation. So it's the journey from information to transformation. Now, an awful lot of religion that we have today, I think I'm being fair in saying this, is trapped at the information stage. And let me try to describe stage 1 for you. It is where you have to start. When you were in first grade, second grade, all the way up to 10th grade, it's largely just a gathering of information. And you see it in little 10, 11-year-old boys. Information quickly becomes power. And you want to pretend my information's better than your information, you know? The way many people use the Bible is exactly that way. It reveals the lowest level of consciousness. I have the true information. It's the gathering of data, of facts, of formulas, yet always searching for more correct information, where you want to read more books. 5s on the Enneagram are notorious for that. If you think you know parts and names for things, that makes you smart. And in fact, the IQ test that most of us grew up with, by my understanding of stages of consciousness, the IQ test that defined most of us in this room as either smart or stupid was entirely based on stage 1 consciousness. In fact, if you had a capacity for detail and memorization, you were called, when I was going through college, you were called a smart person. Now we know that really isn't true. Just a capacity for detail. You could always get A's on your test because you'd parrot back to the professor exactly what he told you, and that would flatter his ego because you remembered what he told you. But it showed no capacity for synthesis, for integration, for putting together history with philosophy, with psychology, with theology, because that's higher level, which quite honestly, very few people, it seems to me, are able to get to. You can't get somewhere if you were never told it was there. You can't get somewhere if no one ever told you what to look for. And so we're massively producing specialists in our universities. You know, the very word university, created by the Franciscans and Dominicans, was the idea of truth all turning around unus versus, turning around one thing. The one thing was God. But to be university educated was supposed to mean you were a generalist. I think I was the last generation of seminarians that got the liberal arts education. We had music, we had poetry, we had science, we had philosophy, we had history, we had anthropology, sociology, just a little bit of everything, so you could be a universally educated man and talk a little bit with some degree of intelligence about everything. But dang it, universities now have become creating specialists for jobs, which is a good thing. But what we're going to see is that's at best stage 2. So, stage 1 is the information stage, the technician stage. My information is better than your information. It keeps you at the level of power struggle, because knowledge is power now, passing for intelligence. Information passing for intelligence. But some people, thank God, move to stage 2. And if I call the first one the information stage, I'll call the second one the knowledge stage. Thank God we have these English words for these different stages. The knowledge stage is when you begin to see patterns between history and philosophy and psychology or whatever it might be. When you connect bits of information into at least small wholes, W-H-O-L-E-S. This is the little engineer, the little scientist, who can put things together at least at some level. This is much needed, and I'm not here to criticize this. I wouldn't entrust my truck to anybody unless they've at least at stage 2. Do you understand? Because I lift up the hood of my pickup and it's just a bunch of pipes, and I have no mechanical knowledge whatsoever. My father was brilliant at it. I must have been a great disappointment to him because I'd come home and he'd always pick up the hood and start working on my car because he loved it and he knew I didn't understand it at all. So the knowledge stage is when you know why that pipe is there and why that oil is needed in that engine or whatever it might be. But it's some initial level of synthetic thinking. The first move beyond either or thinking to both and thinking. This needs that. It's what we would now call an ecology, systems theory, where you start seeing things in relationship to one another. You see how we're mirroring the Trinity as we grow up. Now, stage 3 is when you begin to see bigger patterns and make bigger connections. So if stage 2 is the little scientist, the little technician, stage 3 is the big scientist. People who start like, was it Steve Jobs, building his computer factory outside of the regular one where people could think in bigger ways. Now, people who move to stage 3, you see this in theology and philosophy, in science, in mechanics too, or in the computer world. At the beginnings, they're always considered dangerous, right? Because they're operating outside of the usual agreed upon logic. Do you know, for example, Bill Gates went to school in Albuquerque. And back in, I guess, the 60s, or whenever he was there, he offered the city fathers of our hometown to build the first computer factory there. Well, I think the city fathers of Albuquerque had never heard of computers. They said, no, well, we're not interested. We don't think that's going to go anywhere. So, so Bill Gates moved, thank God, we say, to the Silicon Valley or wherever he moved, and they became, the center of all this. He threw the Pentium chip factory as a little sop to us to make us not feel too bad. But there was no reason in the ordinarily educated person of the 1960s to trust a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs. These are third level people at least. Now, I'm going to divide the third level into 2 stages, and I'll tell you why I'm doing that. Because I'm still trained in scholastic philosophy and theology. Both Thomas Aquinas with the Dominicans and John Duns Scotus for us Franciscans, they separated intelligence. This is our third stage, intelligence. into two different levels. Aquinas called the first one cognitive intelligence, and he called the second one knowing things by connaturality. I'll explain that in a minute. Hold on to it. It's crucial for understanding contemplation. John Duns Scotus, our Franciscan scholar, he called it analytical intelligence and intuitive intelligence. Two different kinds of intelligence, right? Well, the only reason I'm telling you that is so you don't think this is a new idea. Do you understand? This is very traditional. I'm not making this up. But we just haven't had the scholarship to put it all together till the recent work of all these people like James Fowler and Carol Gilligan and Ken Wilber and Claire Graves. And they're all saying there's clearly stages that people, if you observe humanity, individuals go through it and cultures go through it too. Although the vast majority of people, it's agreed upon by the people I'm reading, never go beyond stage 1 or 2. Vast majority of people, never. That's why contemplation was not understandable or accessible to most people, because contemplation is at least 3.5. So, now that's not to make you feel superior, all right? But it might help you understand, if you're highly rational, why you have resistance to it. Or why you don't go very far in it, because your rational mind keeps pulling you back into stages 1 and 2. So at stage 3, first half of 3, analytic intelligence, you can still be dualistic, ego-based. It doesn't really apply yet. Much integration with heart, with prayer, with God, with transcendence, with ethics. And that's much of our problem, that we have people who can be technicians and produce gas chambers, right? But don't have the moral development to know that they shouldn't use those for human beings. That's been the problem for the whole 20th century. That we have people in the first and second stages with no development simultaneously with ethics and prayer and transcendence and God experience. And that's what's tearing Western civilization apart. That people can get rich and famous while, I don't mean to be unkind, but while actually being rather stupid in terms of what wisdom is all about. So at this point, you can still emphasize the entire external, pragmatic, workable world. You emphasize forms because you haven't yet experienced the formless. You haven't necessarily had, we would say as believers, God experience. And so everybody I'm reading would agree that the big Passover place is between 3 and 3.5. To move from analytic intelligence to intuitive intelligence, or knowing by connaturality, you have to have an epiphany, an enlightenment. Now, I would say what history tells us is that the two great moments or experiences that tend to catapult you from analytic intelligence to intuitive intelligence are suffering and love. Those are the biggies. The first line of Mary Oliver's poem. Love, true love, great love. Love that perseveres and lasts, which always includes suffering, by the way. And great suffering. Break down any system of quid pro quo logic, right? I mean, you had to know that when you first fell in love with your wife or your husband or your children. This is not rational, right? It has nothing to do. And you even let go of rationality. I mean, your kids, all the money they cost you, you know? You would never pay that much money for anybody else. And you say, why am I letting them, debilitate my finances? It's this irrational thing called love, which cannot be computed inside of tit for tat anything. And any of you who've suffered greatly or have accompanied someone through suffering, suffering does it even quicker. I mean, when I'm watching this war series this week, Ken Burns' masterpiece, and I just go to bed so sad every night, thinking of when I was being born in 1943, what these poor little 21-year-old kids were going through on the German side and the American side. Just grunts who are being shot down for nations. And you just say, why? They never got a chance to live like I've had, like you've had. It's just, there's no justice to the world. It's completely dishonest. It's completely unfair is the better word. Now that absurdity of suffering, the absurdity of unjust suffering and tragedy breaks down any system of logic very quickly. And what I want to say is that is not all bad. I'm not trying to justify the suffering and say suffering is wonderful, but it destabilizes the ego, destabilizes dualistic thinking, and you have to open up to mystery to survive another day without going crazy. These wonderful Indian sisters here are picking up ladies off the street in India who literally become mentally ill from the amount of suffering they have to endure. Where in many parts of India, women have they have less right than cattle. Cattle are more highly regarded in many parts of India than a woman. And a woman sometimes is so horribly treated, not just in India, but in many parts of history, actually, that many of them lose their minds, that life should not be this unjust, treated almost like slaves. That's what happens to the mind, to the psyche, to the soul, when I can't compute it. Now, Jesus gave us meaning for that. He said, even when you can't compute it, that might be the way through. That's why the cross is central for our understanding of the universe. And knowing that 98% of the people who lived on this planet since the beginning of time have had very hard lives. Brothers and sisters, you've got to know we're the exception. Our lives are desperately easy compared to what most people have had to endure. So, if that's true at all, I wouldn't be surprised that at many primal cultures, many people who lived earlier might have had easier access to contemplation than we do. Because that quid pro quo non-logic broke down much earlier. They had to surrender to mystery. Now that's the second level of intelligence, which Scotus calls intuitive intelligence, which Aquinas calls knowing by connaturality. Now, I'm going to use that word. It's a wonderful word. And because I think it's key to understanding the spiritual life. God is not known like any other object of information. What's created atheism, largely in the West, is the assumption that God can be known as you know a tree or a bit of scientific data, and that you can prove it right or wrong. God knowledge is in a category all its own. In fact, if you listen to the mystics, they will describe it almost a non-knowing that is allowed within you because you are known. It's a feeling of being known more than knowing. Do you follow me? It's not a feeling of I'm holding my reality together with perfect logic and understanding. It's more a feeling of being held. Not you holding, but someone is holding me so well that I can hold things that I couldn't have held otherwise. That's why saints are capable of such immense disparity and injustice and suffering and absurdity without turning bitter, without turning cynical. So God knowledge, in a way, is not a knowing, it's a being known through. And we're back to the Trinity again. It's a being held through. Now, Aquinas called that knowing things by affinity, knowing things by kinship, or knowing things by sharing the same nature. So, loving people tend to see loving people over there. Did you know that? The love that abides inside of them tends to give that same grace to other people. I've learned this because there's these loving people who think I'm so loving. And it's so obvious to me, I wish I were a more loving person. But I know when I've met loving people. And they'll come and say, oh, Richard, you're such a loving, good priest. And I can't help but say back to them, you're telling me more about you than you are about me. And hateful people will find some reason to hate me. This is just learned by experience. But I know you can apply it to yourself. When people are determined that you are a heretic, a sinner, a bad person, they'll find plenty of reason to justify it. They don't have to look far at all. Anybody who's decided to hate you will find the legitimating data within 5 minutes. And they never realize that it tells more about them than about you. When your eyes are hateful, you will see it over there. When your eyes are loving, you will see love over there. That's knowing by connaturality. Meister Eckhart, the Dominican mystic, he said it so well. The eyes by which we look back at God are the very same eyes by which God first looked at us. All we're doing is completing the circuit. Follow? You receive the gaze, and once you learn to abide inside of that gaze of being a beloved son, a beloved daughter, and you learn how to live there permanently, with some degree of permanence, as Thomas said so well this morning. I never think it's 24 hours a day. But with some degree of permanence, you find yourself looking back at the world with beloved eyes. Right? That's when logic breaks down. That's when you move from analytic intelligence to intuition, or knowing by affinity. And at that point, religion changes. And you recognize that the goal is not to change other people. The best goal for the rest of your life is to keep cleaning these lenses, right? That your job for the rest of your life is to change yourself. Now, don't hear that in a narcissistic way, because that's going to be work. And it's going to make you much more loving toward other people. But 9 times out of 10, I'm going to say it. I know you logicians will disagree with me, but I'm going to say it. 9 times out of 10, you are the problem. You say, no, that isn't true, Richard. That isn't true. She is the problem, right? My husband is the problem, The Catholic Church is the problem. George Bush is the problem, And on another level, I know that's also true, right? But I wasn't using those examples for that reason. But don't start there. Because if you start there, you'll end there. And you'll spend your whole life thinking that if you can get rid of George Bush, American politics is going to change. It isn't, all right? Because he merely reflects the state of consciousness of the whole country. He is us. We elect people who reflect our level of consciousness. And if we elect presidents, any president who is a 1 or 2 level president, that's because America, by and large, is a 1 or 2 level country and doesn't have a lot of highly developed people who can see the bigger picture. So intuitive intelligence, I'm going to use just a play on words. The first 1, 2, and 3, you tend to measure reality. It's all quantifying information and data and facts. Like we old-time Catholics, 3 masses were better than 1. Jesus only had 1 mass his whole life. Did you ever think of that? But at early level thinking, everything more is better. It's all quantified. 7 was really good, and 9 was just miraculous. 9 of anything. We called it a novena. You just do it 9 times, and it just bends the arm of God. He can't resist. No, these aren't bad people. They're good people, but it's all the quantification of reality, measuring reality. When you get to 3.5, you know what's happened is you've met reality. Once you meet reality instead of measuring reality, your whole vision changes. It becomes what Martin Buber calls the I-thou relationship. Everything's about presence. Everything's about connection. It's not about being correct anymore. It's about being connected. Those are 2 different games, right? It's not about being right. It's about being in right relationship, like the Trinity. Early level Christianity is obsessed with being right. I'm right, because that's a power game. Right relationship, you almost never get right relationship till after you've apologized and forgiven. You know that, you who are married, don't you? And after that, you don't feel so right anymore. You had to admit that she was half right, maybe more than that. Or he was half right. Forgiveness and apology always humiliates the ego. We don't want to be in right relationship. We'd much sooner be autonomously right. Even Dr. Phil says this. You've heard Dr. Phil, huh? Wasn't he from Texas? I think he was. Yeah. And he says halfway through every marriage, you've got to ask the couple in marriage counseling, you got to decide today, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And I agree with him. In the marriage counseling I've done, 8 out of 10, I want to be right. I don't want to be happy. They wouldn't say it that way. They think they can be right and be happy. It never happens. It never happens. If your agenda is I'm going to be right in every argument with my wife, you will never be happy. All right? I can tell you that for sure. If you want to be right in every argument with the church or the country, you're never going to be happy. Because you're still in the first half of life. You're still concerned with I've got better information than you've got. So knowing by affinity is the beginnings of contemplation, where God in me knows God. The Spirit in me recognizes the Spirit over there. Love in me recognizes and increases love over there. It's not a logical knowing of reality. It's an intuitive feel for the whole, right? Now, logicians will dismiss it. They say, oh, that sounds sentimental. The Pope would even call it probably relativism. I don't think so. Because I'm not for a moment here trying to dismiss your critical faculties. If I can say this, I'm trying to sharpen your critical faculties, right? So you can really read between the lines what looks like it's happening and what's really happening. Our politicians love to say, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. That's level 1 and 2, all right? Level 3.5 says, it could be a swan or a goose, right? But it never occurred to them, there are, or a loon. But if you've never seen a loon, you don't know that it could pass for a duck, but it isn't. All right. See, but they're still measuring reality. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. That's dualistic thinking. They love to talk that way. Even people in the church who should know about paradox. That was the whole beginning conference we gave this year where Mary Beth Ingham joined me, and she's a master on John Duns Scotus. And she presented how his thinking was always the dealing with mystery and with paradox. Why? Because John Duns Scotus' entire philosophy was built on the doctrine of the Trinity. That if the Trinity is the template of reality, reality is relational, not autonomous, not self-sufficient. So this is the crossover point. When you can move from analytic to intuitive, I want to say it again, the only ways to pass you over: great love, great suffering, and primarily and most quickly, one moment of God experience. One moment where the veil parts and you know. And you know that it's okay, that you're okay. It takes away all fear. It only needs to happen once. And you know your universe is reshaped. And you will forever read reality from a very different platform, with a very different set of eyes. Now, I warn you, at that stage, even 3.5, where it's just beginning to dawn on you, you will feel a little crazy. You will not fit into most cocktail party conversation. You will say fee on both of your houses to Republicans and Democrats, to liberals and conservatives. You won't fit into any of the usual groups. That's why Jesus said, when you follow me, the whole world will hate you. Those usual labels don't make much sense anymore. You recognize liberals have half the truth and conservatives have half of the truth, And the Son of Man, the one who follows the Son of Man, has nowhere to lay his head. Really not in either camp. You say, you're right on this, but you're right on that. But that won't fit you into Texas cocktail parties. You understand? Because everybody wants to invite to their cocktail party fellow white Republicans, right? And if you don't think like that and you offer some bit of intuitive, bigger picture awareness, you will probably not be invited back to the next cocktail party. Now, if that's where your whole agenda and world is, you'll retreat. You'll retreat to stages 1 and 2 where most people will like you. Understand? At 3.5, you start not fitting in, and you have to come to contemplative outreach conventions to be, to be sure that you're sane. Because you start feeling crazy out there. What's wrong with me? I don't fit in my parish anymore. I don't fit, and you won't. So this is the beginning of non-dual thinking, the beginnings of unitive consciousness. Now again, if you think this is some kind of new stuff from New Mexico, let's go back to the early Desert Fathers already. Gave us 3 stages, the purgative way, the illumination way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way. It's all going toward non-dual consciousness. But stages 1 and stages 2 and 3 are purgation. But intuitive intelligence, 3.5, is the beginnings of illumination. Just the beginnings. Don't think you're there yet. Non-dual thinking is just beginning, but you haven't practiced it enough, you haven't lived with it enough, you haven't maybe studied it enough or been affirmed in it enough to trust yourself. You really think, I'm a bit crazy, and you start keeping your thoughts to yourself. Because at the Thanksgiving dinner, you'll just create a fight. If you talk this way, so you just, you tell your wife to tell you to just, bite your lip. Don't say it. Because you'll create a big fight between the Republicans and the Democrats at the table. What's happening at this stage is head and heart are starting to work together. Starting. This is synthesis. This is integration. When Jesus' most synthetic, integrative line was, you must love the Lord your God with your whole heart, with your whole soul, with your whole mind, with your whole strength. So don't anybody say holistic thinking is some new idea, right? There it is, straight from Jesus. He says, these have got to start working together. And too much of Western Christianity has been entirely head-based, and not just head-based, but left part of that, just right here. And I always say, we priests, we pour water over the forehead, and thank God, because that's where the control tower is. That's what needs baptizing, is right there. But true baptism, and the Baptists are much closer to it than the Catholics, is when the whole body is nakedly immersed into the water. The entire body goes down, and now we've discovered John the Baptist's cave and 28 steps down into the water. Now every woman knows the transformative meaning of 28. We use this in men's work. You say 28 to the men, they don't even bat an eye, you know? When you work with women's groups, they immediately know. 28 is the magic number of the moon, of the woman's cycle, of the stages of death and resurrection, the Paschal mystery which is written into a woman's body. But the male, the reason the male had to have initiation is because it isn't written into our body. We don't understand you got to take 28 steps down into the drowning pool. So with that, we move to stage 4. Information, 1. Knowledge, 2. 3, intelligence, divided into 2 parts. Stage 4, I'm going to call understanding. One begins to connect all these smaller wholes with the whole, we would say God. This would be a somewhat fully integrated worldview. I think Jesus' metaphor for that is the kingdom of God, the big picture. And most of his parables are about living inside of the big picture. And if you read so many of them, they all break down quid pro quo logic. The most obvious one being where the guy who comes at the last hour is paid as much as the one who's been working since the morning. See, that doesn't make sense if you're in stages 1, 2, or even 3. At stage 4, where grace has now become common to you, that parable names the very meaning of your soul. Because you know you're the one who came at the last hour and that you didn't earn this love, you didn't achieve this goodness. It's all the gift of God. So at stage 4, the understanding stage, I begin to be a part of the great chain of being. My desire is not to be individually correct. My desire is to be connected, to live inside of the Trinitarian flow. Visible and invisible, inner and outer, form and formless, matter and spirit now are working together as one. You don't think dualistically that matter is bad and spirit is good, huh? That can't be true because God became flesh in Jesus, which forever made the place of the flesh a good place, not a bad place. But if you haven't experienced incarnation, if you haven't experienced God dwelling in your flesh and that you are the body of Christ, you still will think flesh is bad and spirit is good. I'm convinced, by the way, because I know what you smart ones are thinking right now. You're saying, well, Paul says so. I'm convinced Paul was a mystic and a dialectical thinker who did play off 2 ideas against one another. But we understood him with dualistic mind. But he is not a dualistic thinker. Please take my word for that. It took me 11 tapes to try to teach it. But if once you get it, you get it. He's not dualistic. He's trying to play the 2 ideas off of one another, which is called a dialectic. And that's the way you have to teach very often, to find the tertium quid, the something in between, the spirit between the Father and the Son. So I will call stage 4 mini mysticism. It's early stage contemplation. And for those of you who were involved in the charismatic movement back in the 70s or 80s, or maybe you still are, I do think the great power of the charismatic movement was that it introduced an awful lot of people to mini mysticism. But then they didn't have good contemplative teachers back in the 70s to help them move to understand this first parting of the veil that they call the baptism in the Spirit. And I think that's true of an awful lot of our people. They have the state, the momentary state of unitive consciousness, or a moment of enlightenment, a moment of God experience. But there's no one around like Thomas Keating or John Mayne or Lawrence Freeman or Cynthia Bourgeois to say, okay, here's how you turn this momentary state into a permanent trait. That's what this group is doing. You are learning how to turn these momentary states that the charismatic movement had in all authenticity, I think. But they didn't have the tools and the practices to turn momentary states into permanent traits. And contemplation, contemplative outreach like few other groups. is giving us precisely those tools and those practices to know how to do that. So here I begin to meet reality, not measure it, meet it on its own terms. You let it be what it is, without a need to categorize it, label it, control it, explain it, or even understand it. Now, do you want to know what the word for that is? Faith. I would say, my understanding of biblical faith starts at stage 4. Up to that point, it's all religion. And nothing wrong with religion. It got us all started, and it's good as far as it goes. But where it always does is send you to a bigger picture where you start critically even seeing the dark side of religion. That doesn't mean you throw it out, but you look at it much more critically. That's adult Christianity, and it's happening all over the world today, where we are producing, I think, an amazingly high percentage of stage 3.5, stage 4 people. Now, let me give you this, and this is one of the most important things I'm going to say. The sign that you are at a higher stage, and I know the danger of talking about higher stages. I really do. It appeals to the ego, right? But the sign that you are at a higher stage is that you can be sympathetic, empathetic, and accepting of all the previous stages. That's one of the most important things I'm saying in this hour, right? If you cannot love, accept, understand, be patient with, forgive, use whatever word you want, people in stage 1 or 2, then I know you're in stage 2 yourself, at best. Probably in stage 1. The sign of an enlightened person is you have immense compassion and patience because you know you were there once. Look how long it took for God to get us to where we are today, and how often we've backtracked. By the way, under stress, you go back to stage 1 and 2. Under stress, you regress. Almost everybody does. But once you've had a taste of paradox and mystery, and you don't need to nail everything down, it is what it is. I had a marvelous but very sad funeral for a couple, or a man, who I knew both of them, who had been married almost 60 years, and spent some time talking to the widow afterwards, who's been a dear friend for years. And she's a wise and holy woman, lives in Arizona. And I remember when she said to me, this was only, 3 days after, she says, "Richard, it is what it is." And that was after telling me, she went out in the gully behind her house and said she would just cry uncontrollably. Just how can he not exist anymore? This man that she had loved for 60 years. The world made no sense. And yet she had this grace-filled place inside of her. "Richard, it is what it is, and it's okay." And she meant that. That wasn't said begrudgingly. There was a freedom of soul, a freedom of spirit to accept the absurd, to accept the impossible, the death of someone she'd been bonded with for 60 years. So that's what stage 4 people can say. It is what it is. They don't need to label it, categorize it, fix it, control it, explain it, or even understand it. That's faith. With that, we move to stage 5. And I guess you can begin to hand out those handouts because we're almost at the end. And we're going to call stage 5 the wisdom stage. At stage 5, your mind is now your servant instead of your master. That's what you're practicing in contemplation. You don't let the mind lead the way anymore because it's stinking thinking, as the alcoholics say, It's obsessive thinking, it's self-serving thinking, it's egocentric thinking, it's small mind, it's egocentric self, it's, as Thomas said this morning, it's false self. That mind can't get you very far. And so that mind has to be put to the side. Do you know, both in Isaiah and in Paul, maybe you noted this, when they list the gifts of the Spirit, didn't it strike you as unusual that knowledge and wisdom were 2 different gifts? Didn't you always say, well, aren't they sort of the same thing? No, they're not. Knowledge is the gift of the first half. Wisdom is a completely different gift of the second half. But you got to go through knowledge. There's no nonstop flight to wisdom. Did you know that? No way, no way, no way. Everybody starts egocentric. The best they move to is care, and a small percentage move to universal care. You know, many stay at stage one, egocentrism. That's an overlay on this paradigm. So all previous stages in wisdom are included, used, and honored. You learn from every one of them. Stage one was good. You need some good information. If I didn't have at least a bit of good information, I couldn't be sitting here talking to you now, could I? Huh? Stage two is good, or you can't make sense to people at stage two. You know, at best, both Fowler and Gilligan and Kohlberg, they all said this. All these developmental psychologists and theologians. The best you can do, and this is on a good day, is understand people one stage above yourself. If you're stage two, you can stretch to understand stage three, and that's a stretch. So if we have Jesus, who is clearly a stage 6 person, you see why most of the church has never been prepared to understand the gospel. It's just, he's beyond. And we pull it down, just like we did Paul, into dualistic moralisms. These people are going to heaven, these people are going to hell. You know, it didn't create wisdom, it didn't create compassion, it didn't create patience, it didn't create fortitude or humility, all the things that we call the Christian virtues. So at the wisdom stage, there's no need to divide the field, as I said this morning, for the sake of being right, being in control, or being perfect. Perfection is a mathematical concept not available to human beings. All is allowed to teach you. You are patient with paradox. You are patient with mystery. Paradox, if you're not real familiar with the term, is something that at lower levels of logic appears to be a contradiction. But when you live with it longer, you hold it at more magnanimous levels, the seeming contradiction is overcome. Now, I think that's what faith does for you. Suffering does the same. Love does the same. Where seeming contradictions are overcome in a larger whole. You keep reframing it. And in the bigger whole, the smaller logic doesn't work anymore. What I think it means to be a wise person is to see the big whole, the big picture. We used to say in Latin, sub specie aeternitate. In the light of eternity, when you're on your deathbed, will this really matter? Whether you got in the A line for Southwest Airlines, you know? Now, I say that to you because I got my A boarding pass this morning. Or if someone crowded in front of you, in the end, does that matter? But when you're caught in the little picture, it matters. This is an issue of justice, you know? Ma'am, you crowded in front of me. Well, maybe there is a place for saying that, but maybe there isn't a place. Maybe you need to practice humility or not get in your own way. Do you understand? That might be more valuable for your soul today than asserting your supposed rights to, have your place in line. So you're much more patient with mystery, with paradox, with seeming contradictions. This, I believe, is the contemplative stance as such. Now, this wisdom, usually we just put our foot into it, we try it out, we experience it for a moment in the presence of great pain or great love. So I distinguish stage 5 from stage 6. Stage 6 is when it becomes more or less, and I totally agree with Father Thomas this morning, it never becomes total. Never. I don't think. But more or less, it becomes your regular way of looking at reality. That when you wake up in the morning, you're patient with contradiction, with mystery, and with paradox. In yourself, in the world, in your children. That doesn't mean you don't work to change them if it needs to be. But you can't start. You can't start with the need to change it. You feel the difference? The first lens through which you read the moment. This is why I founded the center. We were a training place for activists because I saw so many peace and justice activists who were angry people, who just needed to change. A constant oppositional energy. They could never be happy with anything. And I recognized so many people who had good peace and justice teaching, read the social documents of the Catholic Church, that maybe they were working to change the world, but they weren't very well changed themselves. And that the first lens has to be, it is what it is. You have to be free to say yes before you say no. That's contemplation. You have to be free to say yes to the moment, to love it for what it is, to accept it for what it is, to not need to change it too much. You follow me? Now, when you're sure you can say yes, and I don't need to change it to be happy. I can get through this day. I'm in union with God, and therefore I'm at the center of the universe. I can get through this day without fixing his problem or changing her right now. Until I can live out of that peace, that freedom, that non-need to fix, control, and change other people. Then, ironically, paradoxically, you're free to move in and work to change it. Isn't that amazing? Because you don't need to change it. And I can feel the difference in 2 minutes between people who have to change you, all right, and people who can say it so kindly. You know, Richard, I maybe I misunderstood you, but did you say, I'm sure it was my misunderstanding. You know, they'll be so humble, but they'll offer their criticisms, and sometimes they're right on. I'll have to say, because I talk so much, I shouldn't have said it that way. You're absolutely right. But it's so easy for me to hear their criticism, do you understand? Because it comes from such a kind, clean, spacious heart, you know? I got an email, I'm not making this up, Thursday before I left. A woman, and I know she meant well, I hope she meant well. She said, every time you use the word he for God, and I try to use both, but I guess I'm not always as balanced as I should be. I do know God is beyond gender. But it was just a one-line email. She said, every time you use the word he for God, I want to vomit. And she said, I wish you would stop talking. I hate you. Goodbye. You know, now, I don't know how she got my email, but you see, this is not going to change the world. This is the kind of angry feminism that is just as dualistic. It's politically correct, but the soul is all wrong. Do you understand? There's no love. There's no communion. So if we were talking face to face, she wouldn't put me in a corner, and I'm sure I would have said maybe some unkind words back if I wasn't really centered and contemplative. Darn, we do that to one another. Do you understand? But whereas when these kind people come up, and very often their advice, their criticism of me is correct. But I can hear it, I can receive it, I can change my vocabulary and say it better next time because they were so filled with love. Co-naturality. The love in them created love in me, allowed me to give them back a loving answer. But in every case, it's got to start with us. I've got to become that loving person that doesn't keep, regenerating the hate and the fear and the oppression and the oppositional energy in this world. So when that becomes a state of life, that's stage 6. Your consciousness actually takes on a new form, transformed, which if practiced, becomes your entire life program. This would be the saint. This would be the enlightened person who can live a greater part of his or her day letting reality be. And they don't need to change it in order to be happy. This would be the fullness of non-dual thinking. So this is going to be my next book. You just received the skeleton of what's going to be my next book. If I can clarify this, and clarify this new way of seeing, I think I will have given the best gift I know how to give to the church and to our politics. Because most of it is still trying to resolve our problems from stages 1 and 2, which only creates more angry people, more liberals versus conservatives, Democrats versus Republicans, gays versus straights. This isn't getting us anywhere, and is not going to create that third something, that common ground where God's Spirit can really work and can really move.